In this video, we're going to be talking about suicide rating scales and checklists. Now, so far we've talked about doing a risk assessment in kind of a free-form way. That is, you, the interviewer, asks a series of questions or engages with the client in a discussion about various aspects about this. Don't forget, accompanying the 3 videos I made that summarize risk factors and protective factors, there's also the handout questions for suicide risk assessment, which, again, as I've mentioned before, give you some examples of how to ask the questions to, elicit that kind of material. So the general free-form risk assessment is the way many people have always done it. It's the way I've always done it, and today, though, we're going to be talking about using rating scales, checklists, other structured instruments. But you have to remember that ultimately it's a clinical judgment. So any of these checklists or rating scales we talk about always have kind of a disclaimer at the end that basically says ultimately the interviewer or the rater or whoever the professional involved is has to use their clinical judgment as a bottom line. You can't rely on the total number of points or any of these kinds of algorithms that we would like to have. It would be nice to be able to do that, but it's not possible. And we talked about that earlier, remember, with the whole idea about the huge number of false positives that almost any kind of prediction scheme ends up with. And then to add to the idea of maybe the attractiveness of rating scales and checklists is that the Joint Commission, which is an important body that accredits hospitals and healthcare organizations, has identified suicide as one of their sentinel events, the kind of events that need to be paid a lot of attention to over the past 10 years or so. And they have recommended that among other things, that some sort of structured instrument or checklist be used for evaluating potentially suicidal people in their emergency rooms and in other parts of a hospital or medical center. Of course, you can put these all together. There's no reason why you can't take a checklist on a clipboard, carry a clipboard into the interview room or the patient room or whatever setting we're in to remind you of questions to ask. You could even use some of these rating scales or checklists as reminders of things to ask. But once again, the bottom line is that this is a clinical judgment and difficult. So there are many, many rating scales and checklists. So I've just chosen a few to give you a flavor of what is available out there. And here's the list we're going to be talking about in this video, a little bit about each one. The SAD Person Scale, which was developed back in the 80s and then later modified to a different version of the SAD Person Scale. And a checklist called IS-PATH-WARM that was developed by the group that I've been a part of, the American Association of Suicidology, really to focus on not just suicide risk in general, but imminent suicide. We have the Hopelessness Scale, developed by Aaron Beck, the founder of cognitive behavioral therapy. And I've posted, all of these I've posted in Sakai for the module we're working on now. The Hopelessness Scale, I've also posted an annotated version that shows you the answers that are worth the whichever number of points, and also an example of how that's been used. The Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale, which has become fairly popular these days, but I think has some drawbacks. The CAMS, which stands for Collaborative Assessment and Management of Suicidality. It's a kind of brief therapy that targets not depression or psychosis or the underlying mental illness that's thought to drive suicidality, but rather to focus directly on the thoughts and actions of suicide and try to reduce those, again, by addressing those directly. And the CAMS has a check form that they call a suicide status form, which is part of that therapy. Then we have a kind of a reminder sheet from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, part of the federal government, and they have a 2-page form called the SAFE-T that we'll be looking at. The VA hospital has a series of organizations called MIREC, I guess, Mental Illness Research, something Clinical Center, and they've published risk stratification table for acute risk. They also have one for chronic risk, but I'm going to hold that, and when we talk about chronic suicide in a later video, then I'll show that one to you then. And finally, a handout also from SAMHSA about telehealth, managing suicidal clients during the COVID pandemic. So we'll start with the SAD person scale. The SAD person scale, as you can see, published in 1983. Now, let me point out as we go through this video that many of these instruments and scales and checklists wouldn't fit on a PowerPoint slide very well. So a more full version I've posted separately in Sakai, and you'll see a lot more detail when if you look directly at the original version. Not part of this video, not part of the PowerPoint for this video, but as an independent posting on Sakai. Now this one's not too bad. The original SAD person scale, and SAD persons is a mnemonic. A mnemonic is when each of the letters is a reminder for some underlying thing that you're supposed to remember. And so in this case, you can see SAD person, S stands for sex, male, A stands for age, D for depression, P for previous suicide attempt, and so on. And each one of these is rated 1 point. So what that really means is that if a person is male, that makes them a certain amount of risk for suicide. And if they have S, the second S, social support's lacking, that's another risk factor equal in strength to being male. Now, first thing to say about this instrument is it has little or no empirical backing. I believe I saw that there's a total of about 3 studies that have actually looked at this in practice, and they've all concluded that the predictive ability of the SAD person scale is practically zero, that it should not be relied on in the sense of trying to predict suicide. And as you can see, how they would do that is at the bottom, if someone scores 7 or above, then you're supposed to put them in the hospital. If someone scores between 3 and 6, you should consider hospitalization, but maybe you could do a close outpatient follow-up, and so on. So there's no empirical support to say that this scoring makes any sense in the real world. This is just a thing made up by experts, for sure. And I didn't put it on the PowerPoint slide because it doesn't fit, but on the document where I've listed the SAD person scales separately, posted in Sakai, I've listed the source, the article, and the experts that put this together, both for the SAD persons and the revised SAD persons. Now the other thing, in addition to the no empirical backing and the empirical studies that have tried to look at that, finding it of no use in actually predicting suicide according to the rating scale that they've developed. But beyond that, I would argue that these SAD person, the mnemonic idea, is not very useful when it comes to suicide, because there's so many different suicide risk factors. Remember, in my free form listing, there's 53 or 54, whatever it is. And so a mnemonic like this can be very useful when you know what the words are, or the terms, or the topics, or the issues, and all you need is a little bit of a jolt to remind you. So a good example of using a mnemonic is a way to remember the order of the planets from the Sun: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And so there's a mnemonic that it's something like my very excellent mother something something. So you remember my very excellent mother, whatever, gives you the V, gives you the M, okay, that's either Mercury or Mars. Which one's the closest to the Sun? Oh yeah, I think it's Mercury. Second, my very, V, what planet begins with V? Oh, of course, Venus. My very excellent, E, okay, what planet begins with E? Oh yeah, Earth. So when you know the planets, sort of, but it's hard to remember, and you don't remember what the order is, then a mnemonic can be very helpful. But when it comes to something like this, where there's so many variables which could all begin with the same letter, that I don't think it's very useful. S stands for sex, male, okay? But S could stand, and we see later, it stands for social supports lacking. I mean, you might think it stands for social supports, which would be backwards. Or the second one is an A, age under 19 or over 45. Well, this is not correct. If we're talking about completed suicide, then over 45 is correct, but under 19 is not correct at all. If we're talking about just suicidal behavior in general, then maybe under 19 would count. You know, a lot of teen attempts and gestures under 19 age group. But age could also, or A, could not only stand for age. If you're thinking about suicide, it could stand for affect, you know, like the sad affect, or it could stand for anger, or it could stand for ambivalence, or, and I'm sure we could think of some others. The D stands for depression, okay? The D could also stand for, well, I can't think of any right now, but P, previous suicide attempt. You'd think that would be under S or SA or something like that, because P, previous, could stand for anything, you know, like previous history of schizophrenia, previous use of weapons, previous dysfunctional family. So using P to stand for previous anything is not a very good use, not a very helpful mnemonic, I don't think. E, ethanol abuse, and so on. So there's so many different words that could be attached to each of these letters. For plan, you would think P would be a plan, but there's no P here. P is previous suicide attempt. You could use that for plan. So instead they use O, organized plan. You wouldn't normally think about plan as being that the O would stand for it. So I don't find this very useful at all. And the same thing is true of the modified sad person scale, where now we have a weighing, okay, a weighing by giving some of these factors 2 points and some factors 1 point. And again, this is based maybe on some individual empirical studies, but no studies that have looked at all of these together, used this point system, and found it to be an accurate prediction of who might be at risk for suicide. It just doesn't exist. And the same issue goes here, only now we've changed from N, no spouse. Now for no spouse, wouldn't you think like single or socially isolated? But it's N, no spouse, but then they changed it to no social supports. N, just using N for no, it could be no anything, right? No alcohol abuse, no history of depression, no previous suicide attempts, whatever. Not very useful. And I want to point out here also that one of the best community suicide prevention programs that's ever been devised anywhere in the world, including the United States, maybe the best, was developed by the U.S. Air Force, of all groups. Now, the Air Force had a lot of concern about suicide among the airmen, and so in the late 90s they developed an elaborate suicide prevention program that unfortunately we don't have time to talk about in this course, but it really, maybe I did talk about it earlier when we talked about the correlation, the risk factor of men who subscribe to the culture of conventional masculinity, because they made an attempt, they have made an attempt somewhat successfully to make a dent in that culture of conventional masculinity in the Air Force program. Try to make it, as opposed to be a man is to be independent and strong, is that it's a strength to ask for help when you need it, as opposed to the conventional masculine response would be have no weakness, or certainly show no weakness. So in any case, the Air Force program has been quite successful, and it actually has lowered the suicide rate in the Air Force and lowered the rates of several other important social variables, such as fights and arguments with other people in general, domestic violence in particular. Anyway, the reason that I want to raise it now is that in the Air Force program, all the new airmen, as part of their basic training, get a couple of hours of orientation to suicide prevention and risk factors for suicide. And so at some point they decided to conduct a little experiment in the Air Force, and they took in a new group of recruits, and they divide them up into these classes of 25 or 30 or whatever. And among several of the classes, they taught suicide risk assessment in the same kind of free-form way that we have been doing in our course right here at Loyola. And in a couple other sections in the Air Force, they decided to use the is path warm, same idea, see, a mnemonic. Is path warm, ideation, S equals substance abuse, P equals, I would think P should be planned, but no, it's purposelessness. This one was developed by the American Association of Suicidology also, and you can see in the more elaborate version that I've posted on Sakai that there's a background and a bit of an explanation behind it. In any case, the Air Force decided to use a mnemonic, and they decided to use is path warm to teach risk factors. And what do you think happened? Well, the classes that used is path warm did more poorly. They had a pre and a post test, right? So before they went in the class, they would ask the airmen or give them some sort of a quiz or a test about identifying suicide risk factors, and then give them the same quiz afterwards. And of course, ideally, everybody should improve significantly after they go through the class. 2 or 3 hours of learning about this stuff. And in true, both groups did improve, but the group that got is path warm did not improve as much as the group that got the more free-form discussion of risk factors. And in the article I read about that highlighted this, one of the most, I think, interesting finding was in the post-test for some of the people, some of the airmen who went through using the mnemonic, they wrote on the post-test is path warm, but they couldn't remember what the I or the S or the P or the A and so on. They couldn't remember what those letters stood for. So they remembered is path warm, but that's all they remembered. So I don't know. For me, that's just another example of mnemonics like this are not very useful. So next, let's talk about the Beck Hopelessness Scale. You probably all heard about the Beck Depression Inventory, and Aaron Beck, who's the father of cognitive therapy, which has been transmogrified later into cognitive behavioral therapy, was the author of these. So in the Beck Hopelessness Scale, again, I've just put an example of some of the questions on the PowerPoint here. You should go to the copy in Sakai where I've included the whole thing, and which I've labeled Beck Scale number 1. The idea being that if you're going to administer a questionnaire like this, then you ought not to telegraph in the title what you're looking for. So the Beck Depression Inventory, I think, is usually titled Mood Scale or something like that. And the Beck Hopelessness Scale has no particular title. In the version that I reprinted, I just called it Beck Scale number 1. So in the version that's in Sakai, you can take a look and see that it is 20 true and false questions, and here's the first 8 of them. For example, I look forward to the future with hope and enthusiasm, and obviously if a person says true, that's a low level of hopelessness and would get 0 points. If on number 2, I might as well give up because I can't make things better for myself, that obviously would be an example of hopelessness, and they would get a point for that. So there's 20 questions, and as I put on the slide here, you need to take a look at the full scale in Sakai to really get a picture of it. But it's just one example. This takes us back to this problem of the high number of false positives. So there's one particular study done of the Beck Hopelessness Scale. Now, the Beck Hopelessness Scale has very good psychometrics, and it's a very good measure of hopelessness, but it's not a very good measure of suicide. Now, hopelessness is an important risk factor, there's no doubt about it, don't forget that. But all I'm saying is just looking at hopelessness by itself is not a very good predictor of suicide. Now, here's this study which included 1,958 people over time, and this is not imminent suicide either. This is people who died of suicide over the course of up to like 5 or 6 years, I believe, after the study. And you can see out of the almost 2,000 people, there were 17 that actually died of suicide. And on the slide here, you can see, for example, that there were 16 people who, well, let me go back. With an instrument like the Beck Hopelessness Scale, 20 points, yes or no, that the maximum possible score is 20, that you have to then try to decide what would be the cutoff point. At what point would you consider this person at risk for suicide or not at risk, for the sake of this kind of a prediction, this kind of a research study? You could say that a person has to score 20, that every question must be answered in a hopeless way, and that would be the people that you would identify as potentially suicidal. But you're definitely going to miss people that way, right? Because there certainly would be people who were suicidal but only had 18 hopeless questions. So it's a question of what they call a cut point. What's the cut point where you would cut off and say, okay, everybody above this is a yes. They scored yes on our hopelessness scale. In this case, we're calling it a test for suicide. And anybody below would be considered a no. And in this study, they tried all different combinations and find that the best combination was 9 or above. Okay, so if using the cut point of 9 or above, it sounds pretty good. As you can see in the first column, looking down, 16 people, well, a total of 17 people died of suicide. 16 of them scored 9 or above on the hopelessness scale. Only one person scored lower than 9 on the hopelessness scale. So the scale identified 16 of the 17 people who went on to kill themselves. But then when you read across, then we see the same problem we saw with the Pokorny study before, and with the hypothetical example that I gave using those pictures of Michigan Stadium. Remember that? And that is, okay, well, 16 people scored 9 or above, and they went on to die of suicide. But unfortunately, 796 other people scored 9 or above and did not go on to die of suicide. So if you just look from the point of view of developing a test, you want to look at the sensitivity and the specificity. And remember, sensitivity, did I put this on a slide? Yeah. Sensitivity is from the point of view of the test, looking at the test as a whole. And in other words, sensitivity is of all the people who go on to get the disease, or in this case, all the people who go on to die of suicide, how many of them score yes on the test? And in this case, it's very good, right? 16 out of 17. Those are true positives, and that's, again, the sensitivity of the test, which is 94%. Very good. But, of course, as I mentioned a minute ago, the cost is 796 false positives. Now, and this is from the point of view if you were trying to develop a test. Now, if you're a clinician using this with an individual client sitting in front of you, then really you're not interested in the test perspective, how many of people who are going to die by suicide, how many score yes on the test. You want to look at it another way. You want to look at it as, if this client in front of me scores a yes on the test, what's the probability that they will actually go on to kill themselves? And here, the Beck Hopelessness Scale does not do so well. This metric is called the positive predictive value. And again, the positive predictive value is the odds of a person scoring yes on the test who will actually go on to die of suicide. And if you look back at the graph, it'd be reading across the top, and we'd find that it's 16 people who died of suicide as compared to 812 who also scored 9 or above, but who did not go on to die of suicide. So in other words, you're sitting with a client, you administer the Beck Hopelessness Scale, they score 9 or above, and the probability that that person actually will go on to die of suicide, 2%. Not very helpful, right? 2%. In fact, people have commented in the past, the most accurate thing you could do would just be to predict no one will ever die of suicide, and you'll always be 99.9% correct, successful. Now, obviously, from our perspective, that doesn't help us at all, but the positive predictive value is an important concept, and so many of the checklists and scales come up with a very low probability of does a positive test mean the person is actually going to die of suicide. So we'll go on and talk about now the Columbia scale. The Columbia scale of where do I have it here? Columbia scale of suicide severity rating scale, and this has become very popular in recent years. 2 pages for the screener. There's I think a more elaborate one later, but I think the reason this has become popular is, again, the Joint Commission is suggesting that hospitals, ERs, inpatient units, and I think it's because suicide, unfortunately, has not been handled very well by hospitals and healthcare centers, that they're recommending that people use kind of structured instruments. And this Columbia scale has become a very popular one, and I think because it really gives you, it's a structured interview. It's not just remember to ask about a plan or remember to ask about history of depression in the family, but rather it's a structured instrument. So now I can't train you obviously right now in how to use it, but I've in Sakai included a link where you can look at a couple video examples of how this is used, and I believe also on the YouTube page for the Columbia Suicide Risk Scale they have some training modules as well. But for example, it starts out with you asking, and you can see it's in italics and bolded, have you wished you were dead or wish you could go to sleep and not wake up? And no matter what they say to that, you also ask, have you actually had any thoughts of killing yourself? And if they say no to the first 2, then you jump down to the next page to suicidal behavior. If they say yes to either one, then you go further down, as you can see, question 3, question 4, and so on. So it's scripted. It gives you the exact way that you might ask these questions. Where do you jump to with a yes or a no? And then under suicidal behavior, have you made a suicide attempt? And notice they have you ask, have you made a suicide attempt, whether the person says yes to either of the ideation questions or not. They still have you ask the client, have you made a suicide attempt? Have you done anything to harm yourself? Have you done anything dangerous where you could have died, etc., etc. Okay. Again, I think you'll be able to read the version of this that I posted on Sakai a little bit better than trying to read it off of the PowerPoint here. Okay, so the Columbia scale. Now we have the CAMS. Now, as I mentioned earlier, CAMS is Collaborative Assessment and Manage of Suicidality, a short-term, empirically supported therapy to try to directly reduce suicidal thinking and suicidal behavior, as opposed to the more traditional concept of trying to lower suicidality by lowering depression or lowering impulsivity or lowering alcohol abuse or whatever it might be. I know Dave Jobs is a psychologist that invented this whole approach to evaluation and treatment, and he's a really good guy, by the way. But in the CAMS, for example, this is used as part of treatment, and it's filled out, I believe, every session, but I include the suicide status form. I think there's a second page that I didn't include. But again, if you look at the original on Sakai, you can see it. You can see here on the PowerPoint that the particular aspects of suicide that are rated, which obviously means these are the things that CAMS focuses on, is psychological pain, stress, agitation, hopelessness, and self-hate. Okay, so it's here's another angle of looking at what are the important variables that lead to suicide. Now, the CAMS, it's empirically supported that it lowers suicidal thinking and suicide attempts. I'm not clear. I'd have to go back and do a little more reading. I'm not sure that there's evidence that it lowers the number of actual suicides, but it lowers suicidal behavior more generally considered. And it's, again, one of the few therapies directed directly at suicidal behavior and thinking. For example, there's also a version of cognitive behavioral therapy for suicidality. So we got the CAMS. And oh yeah, in the Sakai version I have listed both pages of it. Now we have the Safe T, and this is, I don't know what you would call this, is almost like a pocket card. This is a reminder card, and this is developed by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And it's sort of a pocket version, a short version of a lot of the things we've been talking about. There isn't any point scales or anything like that. It's just a list of reminders. And it goes into less detail than my more free-form one, but you can see here that they divide things up. Well, first of all, they sorry, I'm jumping around. They recommend a 5-step evaluation process. Step 1, identify risk factors, especially those that can be modified to reduce risk. Step 2, identify protective factors, especially ones that can be enhanced. Step 3, conduct suicide inquiry, which is where you ask the more specific questions about thoughts, plans, and behavior. Number 4, determine the overall level of risk, low, moderate, or high, and then 5, number 4 includes whatever intervention you do, and then number 5 is to document everything. And then, see on the other side of the card, here's a pretty compact version of many risk factors that it's important to look at, that we've pretty much talked about all of these, I believe. I think it's striking that under precipitants/stressors/interpersonal, which I've just called, stressful events, that they list triggering events related to humiliation, shame, or despair, medical illness, intoxication, and a number of stressful events, but no mention of traumatic stress, for example, which I think is they missed a bet there. Anyway, you can take a look at that and see it's a brief reminder of risk factors, protective factors, some of the questions to ask under suicide inquiry, and then at the bottom a little 3-point scale of some examples of risk and protective factors, some examples of possible interventions. Again, maybe reminders, but the interviewer has to use their own clinical judgment about all of this. Another somewhat similar one is this acute risk stratification table developed by Rocky Mountain MIRIC. And MIRIC stands for something like, it's a division of the VA hospital of mental illness, I can't remember what the R stands for, evaluation and clinical center, where they do research and clinical work around mental illness and suicide in particular. And you can see in this also a kind of reminder sheet, they divide it up into acute risk high, acute risk intermediate, and acute risk low. Some examples of how that plays out. Once again, I think one of the weaknesses of these is they all talk about intent, but they never do mention, as we've talked about before, that if someone does express intent, that's definitely a high-risk variable, a very important high-risk variable, but that if a person does not indicate intent, that really the way to handle that is to consider it a neutral factor, not necessarily a protective factor. And unfortunately, these rating scales and checklists rarely talk about it from that perspective. So now the MIRIC group also has one for chronic suicide risk and chronic risk stratification, but I'm going to hold that one aside because in another video we're going to talk about chronic suicide, which we would address in a somewhat different fashion. And then finally we have this kind of reminder checklist from the Center for Practice Innovations at Columbia, and another group that I don't know about, Suicide Prevention Training, Implementation, Evaluation. Anyway, a 2-page, I guess I only included 1 page in the PowerPoint here, but again, go to Sakai, an original version is posted, and it's just reminders and tips about suicide risk, managing suicidal clients during the pandemic. And now in the body of this they mention consider using a risk assessment tool like the Safe T that we just saw a minute ago, or the Columbia Suicide Severity Scale. But this also just includes some other ideas about dealing with people during COVID, when a lot of the risk assessment and treatment things are happening through telehealth, through remote Zoom and other kinds of video conferencing. All right, so these are a number of different checklists, lists, rating scales. There's many others, as I mentioned. And again, I think it's perfectly legitimate and useful to take any one of these or my questions for suicide risk assessment on a clipboard, take it into the interview room when you're interviewing someone who might be at risk for suicide, but also at the same time know that there's no points you can add up. There's no quote-unquote scientific method to come up with an empirical bottom line judgment here, that this always goes back to our own clinical judgment. Okay, I'll see you next time.